It started as an ordinary flight, the kind that blends into the background of countless others. Passengers filed in, some hurriedly stuffing bags into overhead compartments, others settling into their seats with headphones already in place. Among them was Barron Trump, quietly walking down the aisle. Most passengers barely noticed him, their focus elsewhere, caught up in their own routines. Barron had a first-class seat waiting for him, a space designed for comfort and convenience, a quiet haven for the hours ahead. He could have simply taken his place, blending into the luxury around him without a second thought. But then, something caught his attention, a man, standing further back in the economy section. His uniform was neat but well-worn, the kind that spoke of years of service. He moved carefully, his posture straight but his steps deliberate, like someone carrying more than just physical weight. Barron paused for a moment, observing, thinking. This wasn't hesitation, it was consideration, a decision forming in his mind. He didn't rush, didn't overthink, he simply acted. What happened next wasn't planned. It wasn't rehearsed or announced. It was a gesture so unexpected, so quietly significant, that it left those who saw it unsure of how to react at first. How often do you witness something so simple, yet so meaningful, that it stays with you long after it's over? This wasn't just about a seat on a plane. It was about recognition, respect, and a choice that would ripple far beyond this single flight. Stay with me, because this story isn't just about Barron Trump or the veteran he noticed that day. It's about what happened after, how a single, thoughtful moment turned into something far more profound for everyone who witnessed it. What would you have done if you were in Barron's shoes? And what would it feel like to be the person on the receiving end of such an act? Let's explore that together, step by step, starting from this seemingly ordinary moment that became anything but. Barron Trump wasn't one to draw attention to himself. For all the assumptions people might make about him because of his name, those who knew him would describe him as thoughtful and grounded. On this particular flight, he was simply another traveler, moving quietly through the crowded aisle toward his seat. He wasn't seeking recognition or looking to stand out. For Barron, this was just another trip, one of many, where he planned to relax and let the journey unfold without much fanfare. But there was something about how he was raised, a foundation built on respect for others, particularly those who had served and sacrificed. Barron had been taught to value those moments when you can make a difference, no matter how small. And so, when he noticed the veteran further back in the plane, struggling slightly to settle into the narrow seat, he couldn't just walk by without a second thought. He didn't see a stranger, he saw someone whose service deserved acknowledgement, someone whose presence commanded quiet admiration. It wasn't about proving anything or making a scene. For Barron, it felt natural. If he could do something to make this man's day just a little better, then why wouldn't he? The thought lingered as he reached his first-class seat, the comfortable space waiting for him. But as the image of the veteran replayed in his mind, Barron's decision became clear. And here's where the story takes shape, not in grand gestures or public displays, but in the quiet moment where one person chooses to act out of respect and gratitude. What would you have done in Barron's place? How many of us stop to truly notice the people around us, let alone take a step that could brighten their day? What Barron did next was simple, yet it spoke volumes about the kind of person he is and the lessons he carries with him. Stay with me, because what happens next is a reminder of how even the smallest actions can leave a lasting mark. Not long after Barron had taken his seat, a man in uniform stepped onto the plane. His presence was quiet, but there was something about him that naturally drew attention. His uniform, neatly pressed but worn from years of use, spoke of dedication and experience. He moved carefully, his steps deliberate, as though each one carried more weight than the bags he held. His posture reflected pride, yet his eyes carried the kind of weariness that only comes from a long journey, or perhaps, a lifetime of service. He made his way through the aisle, nodding politely to the passengers he passed, his expression calm yet distant. When he reached his seat near the back of the plane, it was clear the space wasn't built for someone like him. The cramped quarters made it difficult for him to settle in, and as he adjusted his belongings, his discomfort was noticeable. But he didn't complain. Instead, he carried on with the quiet resilience that often accompanies those who've endured far greater challenges than a tight airplane seat. Some passengers glanced his way briefly before returning to their conversations or devices. To most, he was just another traveler, blending into the background of a crowded flight. But not to Barron. Sitting just a few rows ahead, Barron had noticed him the moment he boarded. It wasn't just the uniform that caught his eye, it was the way the man carried himself, with a combination of dignity and humility that spoke volumes without saying a word. Barron found himself thinking about the sacrifices this man might have made, the stories he likely carried but would never share openly. While others looked away, Barron continued to observe, his thoughts racing. What could he do? How could he show respect for someone who had clearly given so much? The answer wasn't grand or complicated, it was right there in front of him. What happens when one person chooses to act on a moment like this? What does it take to truly see someone, to recognize their quiet struggles and step forward in a meaningful way? Stay with me, because Barron's decision was about to set something in motion that no one on that flight could have predicted. Before we continue with this heartfelt story, I just want to take a moment to thank each and every one of you for being here. If you're enjoying this story so far, I'd love for you to hit that like button, it really helps. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring and meaningful stories like this one. Also, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below, it's always incredible to see how far our community reaches. Whether you're watching from your living room, your commute, or halfway around the world, your presence here makes all the difference. Let's keep spreading positivity and kindness together. The plane was nearly at capacity, a typical sight for a busy flight. Passengers shuffled through the narrow aisle, some carefully storing their bags, others squeezing past to find their seats. Overhead compartments clicked shut, and the faint hum of engines filled the cabin. The atmosphere carried the usual mix of pre-flight chaos and quiet anticipation as everyone settled into their spaces for the hours ahead. Among this routine commotion, Barron Trump sat quietly in his first-class seat, a window to the activity unfolding around him. While most passengers were absorbed in their own routines, adjusting their seats, texting one last message, or flipping through magazines, Barron's attention was elsewhere. His gaze followed the veteran as he moved down the aisle, his uniform standing out against the sea of casual travelers. The veteran's presence carried a calm authority. Though he moved with care, there was nothing hesitant about him. His expression was neutral, his focus forward, as he navigated the tight space toward his assigned seat near the back of the plane. Despite the noise around him, he seemed to exist in his own quiet world, unaffected by the distractions of the crowded cabin. Barron couldn't help but notice the small details. The faint wear on the veteran's uniform, the way he carried himself with understated dignity. It wasn't just the uniform that caught Barron's attention, it was the sense of someone who had lived through experiences that most people couldn't begin to imagine. A man who had likely seen challenges far greater than a cramped seat on a plane. As the veteran reached his row, Barron observed the effort it took for him to settle in. The space was tight, the armrests barely accommodating his frame. Yet the veteran didn't complain. He adjusted quietly, placing his belongings under the seat in front of him, then leaning back with a resigned patience that spoke volumes about his character. The scene unfolded in mere moments, but for Barron, it felt significant. He didn't know this man's name or story, but there was something about his presence that made it impossible to look away. Barron found himself thinking about the life this man might have lived, the sacrifices he had made, and the quiet strength he carried with him. As the plane's doors closed and the cabin crew prepared for takeoff, Barron sat back, his mind still on the veteran. What was it about this moment that felt so important? Why couldn't he shake the thought that he needed to do something? What Barron would decide to do next would leave an impression not just on the veteran, but on everyone who saw it unfold. What would you do if you were in Barron's place? How often do we pause to truly notice the people around us, to recognize the quiet stories that might be unfolding right in front of us? This story reminds us that sometimes it takes just one act to create a ripple of change. As Barron sat in his seat, his focus kept drifting back to the veteran. It wasn't just the uniform that stood out, it was the man himself. His movements were deliberate, each step carrying a purpose, but there was a noticeable limp, subtle yet telling, that hinted at a story far deeper than anyone might guess. The uniform, though immaculately kept, showed faint signs of wear, marks that could only come from years of service and countless moments of perseverance. Barron watched as the veteran carefully adjusted his belongings, his expression calm but focused. There was no trace of complaint, no visible frustration, just the quiet patience of someone used to navigating challenges without expecting special treatment. Yet, it was more than his actions that drew Barron's attention, it was his presence. The man seemed to radiate a kind of quiet strength, a humility that didn't demand recognition but somehow deserved it all the same. Most people might have glanced briefly and looked away, returning to their own thoughts or devices. But Barron didn't. He found himself unable to ignore the veteran, his mind racing with questions. Who was this man? What had he been through? What sacrifices had he made, and what stories did he carry with him? Barron's thoughts lingered, a growing sense of respect taking hold. In that moment, a choice began to form in Barron's mind. It wasn't a decision he rushed into or one born out of obligation, it was something deeper. He could have easily stayed in his seat, gone through the flight without a second thought, but that wasn't who he was. His upbringing had taught him to notice moments like this, to recognize when someone else's need outweighed his own comfort. And this was one of those moments. As he sat there, Barron weighed his next steps. What could he do? How could he show his respect for the veteran's service, his quiet resilience? The idea came to him not as a grand gesture, but as a simple act of gratitude, to offer up his seat. It wasn't about making a statement or drawing attention, it was about doing what felt right. What would you have done in his place? Would you have noticed the veteran's quiet struggle, his steady strength? Or would you have let the moment pass, assuming someone else might step in? Barron's decision was about to spark something much bigger, a ripple of kindness that would leave everyone watching inspired. Barron sat for a moment longer, the thought weighing on him. The decision wasn't made impulsively, but with quiet conviction. He glanced toward the veteran one last time, noting the man's calm patience despite the clear discomfort of the cramped seat. Without hesitation, Barron stood up, smoothing his shirt as he walked down the aisle toward the back of the plane. When he reached the veteran's row, Barron leaned slightly toward him, keeping his voice low and respectful. "Excuse me, sir," he said, his tone calm but purposeful. The veteran looked up, his expression shifting from curiosity to mild confusion. Barron gestured toward the front of the plane. "I'd like you to take my seat," he continued, his voice steady but carrying a sincerity that left little room for argument. The veteran hesitated, his brow furrowing slightly as he processed the offer. "That's very kind of you, but there's no need," he said, his tone matching Barron's calm demeanor. The man's humility was evident in his response, as though he wasn't used to accepting such gestures, especially from strangers. Barron met his gaze, offering a small but warm smile. "Please," he said simply. "It's the least I can do. You've done far more than I ever could." There was no trace of pretension in Barron's words, only genuine respect. For a moment, the veteran seemed ready to refuse again, but something in Barron's expression made him pause. The other passengers nearby had begun to notice the exchange, their quiet conversations fading as they watched. The veteran's initial hesitation gave way to a soft nod. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight of gratitude that spoke more than words could express. Barron stepped aside to let him out of the row, motioning toward the front of the plane. The veteran gathered his belongings with care, his movements deliberate but slower now, as though the significance of the gesture was sinking in. As Barron returned to the now empty seat, he noticed the glances from nearby passengers, some smiling, others quietly nodding in approval. It wasn't about attention or recognition, though. For Barron, the moment was deeply personal, a small but meaningful way to show gratitude to someone who had given so much. What would you have done in Barron's place? Would you have noticed the discomfort, the quiet dignity of someone who deserved more? This simple act wasn't about grand gestures or headlines. It was about respect, about one person seeing another and deciding to act. The veteran hesitated, his eyes scanning Barron's face for a moment as though trying to understand why someone so young would offer such a gesture. His brow furrowed slightly, his tone quiet but firm. "You don't have to do that," he said, his words carrying both gratitude and resistance. It was clear he wasn't used to accepting something so thoughtful, let alone from someone he had never met. Barron held his ground, his expression calm yet determined. "Please," he said again, his voice steady but filled with sincerity. "It's the least I can do. You've done more than enough for all of us." The words weren't rehearsed, they were spoken with a conviction that could only come from genuine respect. For a moment, the veteran looked down, his hand tightening slightly around the strap of his bag. There was an emotion in his eyes, a mixture of surprise and humility, as though he wasn't sure how to respond. Finally, he nodded, his voice softer now. "Thank you," he said, almost under his breath, but the weight behind those two words spoke volumes. As the veteran moved toward the front of the plane, there was a noticeable shift in the cabin's atmosphere. Passengers nearby had started to watch the interaction, and though the space was filled with the usual hum of a busy flight, there was an unspoken reverence in the air. A few people exchanged glances, their expressions carrying admiration for what they had just witnessed. As the veteran reached Barron's former seat, he paused for a moment before sitting down, almost as if he needed a second to process what had just happened. His movements were slower, more deliberate, and there was a quiet dignity to the way he settled in. Barron, meanwhile, returned to his new seat further back in the plane, now blending into the crowd but feeling at peace with his decision. This wasn't just about a seat. It was about the way one small act of kindness had created a moment of connection between Barron and the veteran, and between everyone who had witnessed it. It was a reminder that sometimes, the simplest gestures can carry the deepest meaning. As the veteran settled into the first-class seat, the ripple effect of Barron's gesture began to spread through the cabin. Passengers nearby had already started noticing the exchange, their quiet whispers filling the air. Some leaned over to the person next to them, quietly recounting what they'd just seen, while others sat in reflective silence, clearly moved by the moment. The flight attendant who had assisted the veteran in transitioning to his new seat paused for a moment herself. She later described it as one of those rare instances in her career that made her pause and think. "It's not every day you see something so selfless," she remarked to a colleague. "Especially from someone so young." Her words summed up what many of the passengers were thinking but hadn't yet voiced. Further back, a man who had been scrolling on his phone put it down, his expression softening as he leaned slightly into the aisle to get a glimpse of Barron. A woman across the aisle caught his eye and offered a small nod, her face reflecting quiet approval. These weren't grand reactions, but they were genuine, moments of recognition for a kindness that had shifted the mood of the flight. For many, it wasn't just the act itself that stood out, it was the manner in which Barron had done it. No announcements, no effort to draw attention. He'd stepped forward with humility, spoken with sincerity, and quietly returned to his seat. That kind of modesty, paired with the weight of his actions, resonated deeply with everyone who had witnessed it. A child sitting a few rows away tugged at their parent's sleeve, asking in a loud whisper, "Why did he do that?" The parent smiled, leaning down to respond softly, though the words couldn't be heard over the cabin noise. The child's curious expression, however, told the story. This was a moment that could plant seeds of empathy and generosity even in the youngest minds. The atmosphere on the plane had shifted. Conversation softened, and the usual pre-flight commotion felt quieter, more thoughtful. It wasn't just about Barron or the veteran anymore, it was about the reminder that even in a space as ordinary as an airplane cabin, moments of connection and humanity could shine through. What would you have done if you'd been there, witnessing this? Would you have said something to Barron, or simply taken the moment to reflect? These are the kinds of questions passengers were likely asking themselves as they prepared for takeoff. But what none of them knew yet was that this story wasn't finished. What unfolded next would take this simple act of kindness and turn it into something far greater, a memory that would ripple far beyond the duration of the flight. As the veteran eased into the first-class seat, his movements deliberate and careful, the passenger next to him glanced over and did a double take. It wasn't just the uniform that caught their attention, it was the distinct patches stitched onto the fabric, each one telling a story of service and sacrifice. The passenger, a retired history teacher, leaned in slightly, his curiosity piqued. "Excuse me," the man said quietly, not wanting to intrude but unable to hold back his question. "I couldn't help but notice the patches on your uniform. Were you part of the mission in Kandahar?" The veteran turned to him, his face softening with a small, modest smile. "Yes," he replied, his voice calm. "That was one of them." The exchange drew the attention of a few more passengers nearby. The man next to the veteran continued, his voice carrying a mix of respect and awe. "I remember reading about that. You were on the team that rescued those hostages, weren't you?" The veteran hesitated for a moment before nodding slightly. "It was a team effort," he said, his humility evident. "None of it would have been possible without everyone else." The conversation shifted as more details about the veteran's story emerged. It turned out he wasn't just any serviceman, he had been a part of some of the most critical missions overseas, moments that had shaped history and saved lives. And then the most unexpected detail came to light. Years ago, he had been awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration in the United States. He had received it not for one act of bravery, but for a lifetime of courage and dedication. Passengers nearby began to lean in, their interest growing as whispers spread through the cabin. This wasn't just a man in uniform, this was someone whose actions had impacted countless lives, someone who had quietly carried the weight of his service without seeking recognition. The veteran, however, didn't dwell on his achievements. When asked about his experiences, he shifted the focus away from himself. "I was just doing my job," he said simply. "There are plenty of others who deserve just as much credit." His words carried a humility that made the moment even more profound, a stark contrast to the recognition now growing around him. Barron, seated further back, observed the quiet ripple of attention with a sense of quiet satisfaction. He hadn't known the veteran's story when he offered his seat, he hadn't needed to. For him, the gesture had been about respect and gratitude for someone who had clearly given so much. And now, seeing how the man's story was touching everyone around him, Barron felt a deeper understanding of why small acts of kindness matter. What would you have done if you were sitting nearby, hearing the story unfold? Would you have leaned in to listen, or perhaps reflected quietly on the sacrifices made by people like this veteran? As the story of Barron's quiet gesture began to settle in the minds of those on the plane, its impact started to grow in ways no one could have anticipated. Seated just a few rows away, a woman who had been watching the exchange felt a wave of inspiration. She glanced at the veteran now seated in first class, his calm demeanor carrying a new sense of ease, and then at Barron, who had returned to his new seat with a quiet humility. The scene stayed with her. After a few moments of reflection, she reached for her phone. Scrolling through her airline's app, she decided to donate the frequent flyer miles she had been saving. Her intent was simple, to make it possible for more veterans to fly comfortably, perhaps even connecting them with family or providing opportunities they might not have had otherwise. It was a gesture inspired by what she had just witnessed, a chain reaction of kindness sparked by Barron's decision. Meanwhile, a flight attendant who had observed everything from the start decided to share the story. She couldn't shake the image of Barron offering his seat with such sincerity or the way the veteran had hesitated, overwhelmed by gratitude. When she had a free moment, she pulled out her phone and typed up a brief post about the incident, careful to highlight the quiet strength of the veteran and the selflessness of the young man who had given up his seat. She didn't expect much to come of it, but within minutes of landing, the post began gaining traction. Comments poured in from people who were moved by the story, each one sharing their own reflections on kindness and respect. Some even mentioned how it reminded them to look for opportunities to make a difference in their own lives. Back on the plane, the mood continued to shift. Conversations turned quieter, more thoughtful. Passengers who might have otherwise spent the flight lost in their own routines began reflecting on what they had just seen. For some, it was a reminder of the sacrifices veterans make every day. For others, it was a moment to appreciate how small gestures, even on an ordinary flight, could leave a lasting mark. What would you have done in their shoes? Would you have taken the moment to act, inspired by what you had just seen? Or would you have simply carried it with you, letting it plant a seed for future kindness? The ripple effect of one decision was already growing, spreading far beyond the confines of that single plane ride. But this story doesn't stop here. What happened next took this quiet moment of compassion and turned it into a story that would touch lives far beyond the passengers who were there that day. As Barron settled into his new seat near the back of the plane, he glanced toward the front where the veteran was now seated. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, a simple smile passed between them. It wasn't an exchange filled with words or gestures, it didn't need to be. That quiet acknowledgement carried a depth that spoke volumes, a shared understanding that transcended the usual boundaries of strangers. The veteran's smile in return was subtle, but its meaning was clear. It wasn't just gratitude for the seat, it was a recognition of the respect Barron had shown. It was a thank you for seeing him, not as just a passenger in uniform, but as someone whose sacrifices deserved recognition, even in a small, unexpected way. For Barron, the moment was humbling. He hadn't acted for acknowledgement or thanks, but the connection he felt in that brief exchange was profound. The mood on the plane reflected this connection. Conversations continued, but they were softer, more reflective. People who had witnessed the interaction seemed to carry a newfound appreciation for the quiet moments of humanity that often go unnoticed. Even those who hadn't seen it firsthand felt the ripple effect of kindness as it subtly transformed the atmosphere. For Barron, the experience wasn't just about giving up his seat, it was about the lesson he took from the veteran's presence. In the dignified way the veteran carried himself, Barron saw an embodiment of humility, strength, and service. The veteran, too, seemed to carry something from the exchange, a reminder that his sacrifices, though often unspoken, were not forgotten. Have you ever experienced a moment like this? A time when a small act of kindness led to a connection that stayed with you? These moments don't always come with grand gestures or dramatic declarations. They often happen in the quiet spaces, where respect and gratitude speak louder than words ever could. This is where the heart of the story lies, and the way one small choice can create a bridge between people, leaving both changed for the better. Stay with me, because this story isn't over yet. What happens next will show how this single act continued to resonate, creating a lesson not just for those on the plane, but for anyone who hears it. This moment wasn't just about a seat on a plane. It was far more than that. It became a reminder of how the smallest, most unassuming acts of kindness can create waves of meaning, touching not only the person they're intended for but inspiring everyone who witnesses them. Barron's choice to offer his seat reflected something universal, a truth that resonates deeply with all of us. Compassion has the power to connect us in ways we can't always foresee. For those watching, the gesture became more than a story about respect for a veteran. It became an example of how anyone, in any situation, can choose to act with empathy. Some passengers sat quietly, reflecting on what they had seen, while others exchanged knowing glances as if to say, "That's what the world needs more of." It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was profound, sparking conversations that extended far beyond the confines of the cabin. The lesson here is simple but powerful. Kindness doesn't need to be grand to be meaningful. It doesn't require elaborate plans or recognition. Often, it's found in the spontaneous moments when someone chooses to put another person's comfort, dignity, or well-being above their own. It's these choices, made without expectation, that leave a lasting mark. Imagine for a moment how the ripple effect of this one decision might unfold. Maybe the veteran carried that memory with him, sharing the story with family members who were reminded of the value of gratitude. Perhaps the passengers who watched began to see opportunities in their own lives to act with similar generosity, whether it was helping a stranger, supporting a friend, or simply saying thank you more often. How many lives could be touched by one simple moment of respect? When we think about the impact of such acts, it becomes clear that kindness isn't just about the immediate effect, it's about the inspiration it brings. It challenges us to look at the world differently, to notice the people around us, and to understand that even the smallest actions can carry tremendous weight. So, the question for all of us is this: what small act of kindness can you offer today? Who in your life might benefit from a gesture of respect, gratitude, or compassion? You might be surprised by how far-reaching the impact of that single choice can be. This story reminds us that the best lessons often come from the simplest moments. And as we carry this story forward, it becomes more than just an anecdote. It becomes a call to action, a reminder of what we're all capable of when we choose to act with heart and humanity. As Barron sat in his new seat near the back of the plane, he found himself reflecting on what had just happened. The veteran's quiet strength and humble demeanor lingered in his mind. It wasn't just the man's uniform or the patches that spoke of a lifetime of service. It was the way he carried himself, the grace with which he accepted the gesture, and the profound gratitude in his brief smile. For Barron, the interaction had been simple, but its meaning was growing deeper with each passing moment. He realized that the power of the moment wasn't in the act of giving up his seat itself. It wasn't about making a grand statement or drawing attention. It was about the quiet connection that had formed between two strangers, a moment where respect and acknowledgement had spoken louder than any words could have. In that silence, Barron saw the true value of humility and compassion. It wasn't the size of the gesture that mattered, it was the thought behind it. Barron found himself thinking about how easy it is to move through life without noticing the people around you. How many times had he missed opportunities to make someone's day just a little better? This one decision had reminded him of something important: kindness doesn't need an audience to matter. It only needs intention. As the plane continued its journey, Barron looked out the window, the clouds rolling past in quiet stillness. He wondered what the veteran might have been thinking, whether this small act had meant as much to him as it did to Barron. The realization struck him: the exchange wasn't just about what he had done for the veteran, it was about what the veteran had unknowingly given him in return. A moment to pause, reflect, and understand the ripple effect of simple, thoughtful actions. How often do we stop to think about the impact of our choices, even the ones that seem small in the moment? For Barron, this experience was a turning point, a reminder that respect and kindness are not just values to be taught, but actions to be lived. It was a lesson he would carry with him long after the flight had landed, shaping how he approached the world around him. As this story draws to a close, we're left with a reflection that isn't just about Barron or the veteran, it's about all of us. It's a reminder that in a world often filled with noise and distraction, the quietest moments can carry the most profound lessons. What small choice can you make today that might ripple out in ways you can't yet imagine? How can you show kindness to someone who may need it more than you know? If this story inspired you, share it with someone who could use a reminder of the power of compassion. What Barron didn't realize when he offered his seat was just how far-reaching this small act of kindness would become. To him, it was a simple decision, born out of respect and the desire to do what felt right. But for those who witnessed it, and for the veteran himself, it became a moment that stood out, a testament to the power of sincerity and compassion in a world that often moves too fast to notice such things. The ripple effect of that choice didn't stop with the passengers on the plane. It sparked a series of reflections, actions, and even conversations among people who heard the story. It was a reminder that kindness doesn't require fanfare or recognition to make a difference. Sometimes, the quietest gestures carry the loudest impact. As you think about this story, consider how these moments can happen anywhere. On a plane, in a store, even in your own home, each of us has the opportunity to choose compassion over convenience, to take that small extra step to make someone else's day a little brighter. These choices might seem insignificant at the time, but as this story shows, they can leave a lasting impression, not just on the recipient, but on everyone who hears about it. Now, let's turn this reflection into something personal. What's a moment of kindness you've witnessed or experienced that stayed with you? Was it something you did, or perhaps something someone else did for you? Share your story in the comments below. Your words might inspire someone else to pay it forward. If this story touched your heart, Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one, stories that remind us of the good in the world and the simple ways we can contribute to it. And if you know someone who could use a reminder of the power of small acts of kindness, share this video with them. Let's keep the ripple going, one act at a time. Thank you for watching, and remember, it only takes a moment to make a difference. What will your moment be?